Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the History of Miami. My name is Mr. Serrato and I'm a teacher at Miami Southridge Senior High. So for today's episode, what we're going into is the civil rights era of Miami's history, how we look at the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The time was filled with much strife, just as the rest of the country. But as with Miami, it always has its own unique Miami identity as to how these events transpired and how they individually affected our community and its development. Just as with the rest of the South, Miami is no different. Even though Miami does enjoy voting rights for its black citizens, Miami is still segregated, allowing African Americans to only live in defined communities. Now, that doesn't mean that nothing is done for the community. For example, one of the first things that happens in terms of American policies towards the African American community is the first housing project done during the Great Depression and the New Deal is constructed right here in Miami, known as Liberty Square, though more so known as the Pork and Beans Projects. In 1937, it was the first such housing development made specifically for African Americans. Unfortunately, due to its location, not to mention the way that Miami's politics operate, Miami is still a segregated city. It isn't even until 1959, 5 years after the case of Brown v. Board of Education, that Miami-Dade County sees its first integrated school with the integration of Orchard Villa Elementary in 1959. Though the community is able to try and make the best on their own, it does not mean that there is always success. In the origin of the city of Miami, its black workers who constructed Henry Flagler's Railroad were forced to live on the western side of the tracks. This area was known as Color Town. Now, because they were given the right to vote solely for the reason of allowing Miami to incorporate as a city, they did enjoy some things that the rest of the South did not. However, it was still a segregated community. Eventually, the name of Color Town gives way to what we know today as Overtown, as that town over there. It was a vibrant community. It was an artistic community. It was the heart of the black community in Miami. Numerous acts from all across the country would come to Overtown and perform. When black acts would go to Miami Beach and perform, they weren't allowed to stay there. So instead, they would stay in Overtown. It was here in Overtown where you had the historic Lyric Theater, where many of these same acts, which were good enough for whites to perform in Miami Beach, would also perform for the African American community there in Overtown. This area enjoyed much success. However, just as we see in other areas of the country, successful black communities will be torn up, and it is done primarily by the construction of Interstate 95. The decline of Overtown begins with the construction of I-95. As it was introduced in 1956 by the Miami News, the project was described as a quote-unquote slum clearing problem. Now, where I-95 eventually took root, it ripped right through the heart of Overtown, destroying many of the businesses that were there, destroying the opportunities, and also gave a barrier for others to not come and enjoy what Overtown had to offer. Eventually, I-95 is finished and completed in 1959. Just 10 years later, to the north of Overtown, 836 would be completed. This effectively zoned off Overtown from the rest of the county. Whereas prior to the construction of these interstates and highways, people would come into Overtown to patronize the businesses, not just African Americans, but whites and others in the Miami community. They came to see the Lyric Theater. They came to enjoy the arts. They came to enjoy the things that African American society had to give back. Not just give back, but just give to Miami society. But due to the construction of I-95, it ultimately eroded that. It made it nearly impossible to cross over to these parts of town without great effort. And in doing so, it isolated the community, drove away business, and ultimately began the decline of the inner city for many African Americans. In the heat of civil rights, the Miami community will become another epicenter of the movement. In 1968, the Republican Party held its nominating convention in Miami Beach. As you might imagine, there were protests. And soon, following the police response to those protests, including firing into the crowd, riots broke out. It is here in this backdrop, in this background, where the chief of Miami Police states the following: once the looting starts, the shooting starts. It was outright police brutality, and it became the policy of Miami-Dade County. As we saw in the ensuing riots in that year, police would actually shoot 4 unarmed individuals. And as you might imagine, none of these individuals were armed. And even less surprising, no police would be formally charged with any crime in connection with their activities done during the riots. However, these riots would pale in comparison to 12 years later, when we see the actions following the murder of Arthur McDuffie. On December 21st, 1979, Arthur McDuffie would be trailed by 4 Miami-Dade police officers. He would be pulled over and then beaten to death. The police account of the story was that McDuffie had ran a stoplight and in their pursuit had an accident, fell off his motorcycle, and from those injuries he then died. However, the ensuing trial would bring to light the sorts of abuse that the police brought upon Arthur McDuffie. In the trial in 1980, a police officer and person who was there at the scene would say that the police story of him falling off his motorcycle was that of pure fiction. He alleges that in this, the police would drag him off of his bike and proceed to beat him to death with their batons. They cracked his helmet and beat the man to death. He also brings about that McDuffie pleaded for his life and gave up. However, and I think you see where this is going, the trial found them not guilty due to conflicting evidence. And as such, the 4 officers would be free, acquitted of their charges, and in the ensuing days, Miami is brought into chaos.
They would not let me in to sing. I asked the doctor why. They said to me, "We're working on him. You will be able to see him in a couple of hours." There was 4 hours before I seen Arthur. When I did see Arthur, it was like, this is not Arthur. This is not an accident.
When I went and looked at the motorcycle, and I had some background training in accident reconstruction, I know when a motorcycle slides on its side that the pegs that stick out, the rubber pegs where you rest your feet, should have had worn marks on them from coming in contact with the pavement. I didn't find that. I didn't believe that that motorcycle slid on its side.
What did he die from?
He died as a result of blunt head injuries with destruction of his underlying brain. He was beaten to death.
How hard would someone have to hit someone to inflict such an injury?
Amazingly hard.
Beat my child to death. They beat him to death like a dog. Just like a dog. They beat him to death. They beat up his head just like a dog.
The outrage felt in the Miami community was to be expected. When you watch the interview of McDuffie's mother screaming that they beat him like a dog, it's hard not to feel that mother's pain, that community's pain, for everything that has happened to the Black community, the destruction of Overtown, the continued segregation, the riots, the injustice. Overtown and the other Black communities of Miami would erupt into riots. From May 17th through May 20th, 1980, the streets of Miami became the most violent sight in the country since the Civil Rights Movement. The National Guard would be called in with 3,500 troops. And in the ensuing days, 18 people would be killed, 350 hurt, 600 more were arrested. The riots and looting caused more than $100 million in damage. but more consequently, the damage to the black community. Because even in spite of everything that happened, the distrust between them and the Miami County Police Department was made ultimately bare. Everyone saw it for what it was, that justice wasn't able to actually be carried out, because those 4 officers walked free. And because of that, there is deep distrust within the black community as it relates to their relationship with police. It would be that way in any community. But the events of the 1980 McDuffie Riots ultimately sew that distrust shut. And perhaps worse is that the economic damage and failure to reinvest into the black community does ultimately far more damage. The areas are left to rot and decay. It isn't until the late 1990s, early 2000s where we begin to see actual true efforts into how the black community can be revived in these areas. But unfortunately, the damage is too far done. After I-95, after 1968, after 1980, it's kind of hard to wait until the year 2000. In the midst of all of the chaos from the McDuffie Riots is set another event which will transform Miami, that of the Mariel Boatlift. Beginning on April 15, 1980 and lasting until October 31st, with the blessing of Fidel Castro, any Cuban wishing to leave the island and make their way to the United States is allowed to do so. During this effort, more than 150,000 Cubans will make their way. Now, when Castro does this, he does this with one intention: to get rid of the island anyone that he deems to be undesirable. So among the 150,000 people that make their way to the Florida Straits, it is estimated between 16 to 20,000 of them will be from jail or mental institutions. Also in that number are people who are political dissidents who no longer wanted to be part of the Castro regime, not to mention other undesirable groups according to Castro, such as homosexuals. It became a purge from Cuba to get rid of those who they deemed to be undesirable. The overwhelming majority of those who would make their journey to the United States, though, are not among criminals or the like. However, that does not stop that picture being painted of those who would come over, being nicknamed Marielitos, as they were known. Ultimately, what this led to was a change in United States policy. The United States had to make a way to deal with the large influx of numbers of Cuban refugees trying to come into the United States. Now, before, the only policy was that they had to have a family member over who would grab them and then bring them over to the United States. However, this could no longer be feasible with the current issues. Also, during all of this, Haitian refugees are beginning to flee the island of Haiti due to the fact of economic issues, not to mention the brutal dictatorship taking place there. However, this dictatorship was not a communist one, and as some would make the argument, it was also a black problem. Ultimately, what the United States does was it creates what is known as the wet foot, dry foot policy. This policy only extended to Cuban dissidents. Under the policy, any Cuban refugee who was able to step shore onto American soil was allowed to stay. However, if they were to be intercepted at sea, they would be sent back to Cuba unless there was prevailing political danger for that individual. However, as some would point out, there is an admission here, rather someone who was not allowed in, and those are the Haitian refugees. They were not included within the wet foot and dry foot policy. And if you paid attention to the dates of the Mariel Boatlift, this is going on simultaneously with the 1980 McDuffie Riots. Racial tensions at its highest point in Miami, and ultimately becomes to define Miami and the relationships had between the communities therein. The black community continually feels that it is ignored while every effort, it seemed, was made for those Cubans who were coming into Miami. And ultimately that comes to define Miami's future. If you looked at the data in 1960, Miami was 90% white. By the close of the 1980s in 1990, the number would be 10% white. Miami has changed, but in what direction? We're not talking about positive or negative. We're just talking sheer composition and how the Miami of the future would look. But there is one key event that will ultimately seal the fate of Miami as we know it and what it has become today. And that's what we'll address in part 4, 1992's Hurricane Andrew.